All right. Good morning and good afternoon to you all. I see folks are entering the room. We're going to give about a few minutes to allow folks to get in and get settled before we get started with the actual session. And my name is Nana Brantuo, and I am the Policy Manager for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Okay, so good morning to some. Good afternoon to others. My name is Nana Brantuo, and I am the Policy Manager for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I wanted to extend my appreciation to all of you for joining us today for a critical and timely conversation on the role of intersectionality and survivor-centered advocacy and policymaking. Before we go into today's agenda and before I give brief introductions of our wonderful speakers, I wanted to take a moment to recognize and honor all of those Black folks whose lives have been taken as a result of police violence and brutality in the United States and globally. I wanted to uplift all those who are using their platforms in any way possible to amplify that Black Lives Matter. And I wanted to encourage folks to visit the Movement for Black Lives Week of Action website to learn more about the demands and actions that have been crafted by the Movement for Black Lives in defense of Black life. And today's demand is really central to our conversation that we'll be having today, as it calls for the immediate relief of our communities, and specifically the moving the development, creation, and implementation of a stimulus package that has clear material benefits for Black people. And I'm going to drop the link in the chat as well, just so folks are able to be connected and to learn more about what's going on. Before jumping into our conversation, I want to take an opportunity to introduce our speakers. And then after introducing our speakers, we'll hear from the Hotline CEO, Katie Ray Jones, who will talk a bit about the Hotline's commitment to intersectionality, and then we'll get right into the conversation. So today, starting with Andrea J. Ritchie. Andrea J. Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor who has engaged in research, advocacy, and litigation focused on policing and criminalization of women and LGBTQ people of color over the past 2 decades. She's the author of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, and co-author of Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women and Queer Injustice, the Criminalization of LGBTQ People in the United States. She is a nationally recognized expert on issues of policing and gender-based violence, and is currently a researcher in residence on race, gender, sexuality, and criminalization at the Bernard Center for Research on Women in New York City. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrea. We are also joined today by April Jemison, who serves as the Director of Training for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, where she develops curriculum and provides the hotline's 95-hour training on domestic violence, healthy relationships, and culturally responsive advocacy to new and tenured advocates year-round. April completed her master's in counseling psychology from Texas A&M International University and holds over 500 hours of clinical therapy experience and over 9 years experience providing training and education in the helping field, serving both nonprofit and higher education organizations. April is invested in the movement towards violence prevention and reduction and is dedicated to employing a social justice lens to advocate for survivors of abuse and center the needs of the most affected and most marginalized populations. Thank you so much for joining us, April. That's next followed by Lee Goodmark. Lee Goodmark is the Marjorie Cook Professor of Law at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. Professor Goodmark directs the Clinical Law Program, teaches family law, gender in law, and gender violence in the law, and directs the Gender Violence Clinic. Professor Goodmark is the author of Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a balanced policy approach to intimate partner violence, and A Troubled Marriage, Domestic Violence in the Legal System, which was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title of 2012. Professor Goodmark's work on intimate partner violence has appeared in numerous journals, law reviews, and publications, including Violence Against Women, the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, the Yale Journal on Law and Feminism, and the New York Times. And last but not least, Mariah Monsanto, who uses she, they pronouns, is a Black femme queer woman all at once and all of the time, and current organizer for BYP 100's national campaign, She Safe, We Safe. BYP 100 is a Black autonomous base building organization that believes in addressing social injustice using Black queer feminist praxis. The She Safe, We Safe campaign aims to end gender-based violence perpetuated by the state and experienced by Black women, girls, femmes, and gender nonconforming folk by reallocating funds from police and into community-determined programs, and increasing interventions to address gender violence independent from law enforcement. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Now I would like to pass it over to Katie Ray Jones, the Hotline CEO, to talk more about the Hotline's commitment to intersectionality.
Thank you, Nana, so much for your introduction. And I apologize that my dogs have chosen this exact moment in time to also protest what is happening in our country. As Nana mentioned, I'm Katie Ray Jones. I'm CEO of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. It's my honor and privilege to serve in this role. I want to thank you all for joining our policy team today to discuss the importance of intersectionality in policymaking and advocacy that center survivors. In this moment, it's crucial for allies to show up for communities closest to the pain, uplift their efforts and messages, and actively join together against white supremacy. We must actively work towards dismantling the systems that oppress Black, Indigenous, and non-Black communities of color that far too often impact many of the survivors we work with daily. On that note, I'm glad that this critical conversation is happening. I feel like it's way overdue, and I apologize that the hotline has not had this conversation sooner. First things, a few things about the hotline. In February of 1996, the hotline took our first call. Since then, we've received and served over 5 million callers, chatters, and texts from across the country and our US territories in order to fulfill our vision and mission, which is moving towards a world in which all relationships are positive, healthy, and free from violence. The hotline has several core values that guide our work, including valuing diverse perspectives and striving to incorporate an anti-oppression lens in all aspects of our work. All of our work begins and ends with the interests of survivors of relationship abuse in mind. And our commitment to social justice is also a commitment to intersectionality. Intersectionality helps us better frame and better address the needs and experiences of survivors from underserved, culturally specific communities. We are currently in the process of analyzing our data from our contacts to track how COVID-19 impacts victims and survivors of domestic violence. And we know that any external factors that add stress, isolation, and financial strain can create circumstances where a survivor's safety is further compromised. This pandemic has elements of all three. While you'll have to tune into our social media when the full report is released, here are a few snapshots. From March 16th to May 16th, we answered over 62,000 contacts, and we had a 9% increase in total contacts received. We've heard from survivors how COVID-19 was being used by their abusers. And in one story, we heard that a caller who had tested positive for COVID-19, their abuser was keeping them in isolation and preventing them from contacting their family. The survivor was on a path to becoming an American citizen, but the abuser continually threatened the survivor with deportation. One of the most important services our amazing advocates offer is personalized safety planning. And this is especially critical as survivors navigate shelter-in-place orders and reduced local domestic violence support services because of social distancing. The long-term impacts of COVID-19 will be far-reaching long after this pandemic ends, and our top priority remains keeping our staff safe while continuing to serve survivors. We are grateful for all those who have been sharing our information and reaching out to survivors in their lives. And we want to thank you again for joining us in this necessary conversation, and we look forward to the questions and feedback it generates. Back over to you, Nana, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing. And now we can jump into the conversation. I'm ready to give the first question for today, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the panelists' thoughts and opinions and perspectives. So Kimberlé Crenshaw has described intersectionality as a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. I wanted to hear more in terms of when you're centering the experiences and the needs of survivors in both advocacy and policy, especially those from marginalized communities. Why is it so necessary that our framing is intersectional? Why is it so necessary that when we are thinking through solutions, we're thinking from an intersectional lens? And I wanted to then open up for any of our panelists to begin discussion.
I guess I'll jump in. I think from the perspective, I'm thinking about it particularly in the context of police violence, which we're sort of all very focused on in this moment. I think my work has been about ensuring that we take an intersectional approach to police violence, because if we don't understand the full scope of the problem, then we're not going to advance solutions that address the complexity of what we're facing. So for instance, in the context of state violence against Black people, if we don't understand Breonna Taylor's case and Tony McDade's case as part of our analysis alongside George Floyd's, then we're not going to understand the full range of how police violence plays out, what the drivers are, and what kinds of solutions we need. And that's, to me, the reason that we need to be looking at it. And we can't, all Black Lives Matter, we can't be leaving anyone behind. And so we can't be looking at a problem through a lens that doesn't incorporate the perspectives of survivors, Black survivors of multiple forms of violence. We can't do it without looking through the lens of the experiences of Black disabled people, of Black Indigenous people, of Black migrants. And if we leave anyone out, then the solutions we come up with or we pursue are going to leave our family behind, and we can't do that.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Andrea, for grounding us there for the start. Definitely what you said in terms of when we say Black Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter, there's so many iterations of Black that cannot be ignored and we can afford to not consider if we're gonna make sure that everybody gets free. I'm thinking of Black differently able people. I'm thinking of Black migrants. I'm thinking of Black atypical folks. And I'm super appreciative of the solidarity that's been shown as of late on social media with the social activism, which was a bit misplaced in terms of Blacking Out was meant to uplift the work that folks have been doing on the ground. But what I've also noticed is a selective choosing on who deserves to be mourned. There's plenty of people who have been memorialized in beautiful artwork, but I don't see the Nina Pops and I don't see the Tony McDades as much. And again, when that happens, it's a moral decision on who deserves to be mourned and who deserves to be cared about. And so, yeah, intersectionality is going to be more important in terms of considering how we frame our social justice work, how we frame our policy work, and also when we consider where our morals and values lie in terms of city budgets, council budgets, and where the resources go into our communities.
So I would just add that I also think that intersectionality helps us to undo some of the historical harm that's been done in the way that the anti-violence movement characterized who was a victim of violence. In order to make political gains, this movement said frequently to anyone who would listen, you know, this is not just a problem of people of color. This is not just a problem of poor people. It's everybody's problem. And part of that was about getting the white people in power to be willing to do something about it. That if they thought it would be their sisters or their daughters or their mothers who were being affected, they would be more likely to do the work. And while it's not untrue that all people can be affected by intimate partner violence, it is also true that people are disproportionately affected, and that they are disproportionately affected by virtue of race, by virtue of socioeconomic class, by virtue of disability. And when we erase those kind of the ways in which people are disproportionately affected, we then dilute policymaking on behalf of those folks who are most marginalized. And so intersectionality lets us kind of come back from that historical place of saying it's everyone's problem to say, well, it may be everyone's problem, but for some folks, it's particularly debilitating. Let's talk about the ways in which identities create and reinforce oppression.
Hello, I'm April, and I'm the director of training at the Hotline, so I can speak to how, when it comes to advocacy, without an intersectional framework lens, we'd be missing the mark significantly, even if we bring it to the most basic model that is used widely in the intimate partner violence field, right? The power and control model. There's a lot that is kind of comes with a lot of asterisks when the field is using that model because it's missing multiplicities of identities, right? It's a very gendered model. It's a very heteronormative model. It assumes that it's a relationship between men and women. It assumes that the abusive partner is the man in the relationship. And so if I were to only use that in the training for our new advocates, we would be having a huge disservice for the survivors, and we would not be centering their needs. And so we have fortunately been able to pull from all of the adapted versions of that power and control model that include different populations, right? So LGBTQ populations, we have been able to refer to some that focus specifically on sex trafficking done by the Polaris Project. And we need to kind of include all of those models in order to talk about this one type of violence and really have that at the forefront. Because if we were to stick to that base Duluth model, we'd be not fully taking in the experience or the full experience of what our survivors are actually living through. So what are the multiplicities of tactics that are being used? Are there racist tactics that their abusive partners are using? We see this a lot with our migrant survivors as well. And so without that intersectionality framework, we'd be not serving everyone who's calling at the hotline and meeting their needs.
Thank you so much for that, April. Thank you to all of you really for your perspective and what you're offering, because it's very important to keep all of this in mind, in particular in the current moment throughout the pandemic. And now I wanted to ask, and I'm hoping April and Mariah, you would be able to offer insight in particular around your work, working with advocates and also as an organizer. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, like what have you heard most from survivors? And what are their stories highlighting, in particular in terms of like their needs, what they're able to access and what they're unable to access? And how does that then, why is it important when we're uplifting and amplifying these stories that we're making sure we're addressing the intersectionality of folks' identities and the oppressions that they're faced with.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nana. I think for, in terms of speaking how we've been moving as organizers in this moment, I think what folks don't, maybe folks realize or not, but the most marginalized of us are always and have always been the ones taking care of each other. And BYP 100 is an organization of all Black folks, and a lot of our members are queer folks. And so we're the ones that this is impacting the most, you know? And so a lot of it looks like how can we be supported? Like, how do we show up in this moment and show up for ourselves at the same time? It looks like shifting a lot of our work to mutual aid resources for ourselves and for our community. In terms of the stories of survivors that we've been collecting via this story collection project, the current aspect of the She Safe, We Safe campaign, there's definitely been a different level of communication in terms of trying to engage with folks. Folks are just trying to make it. Folks are really just trying to survive this time. And what's been beautiful about it, it's been proof day by day that we literally are all that we need, and that we can take care of ourselves, and that we don't need policing, we actually need community care. And that's been showing up in this moment ever so much and ever so present, based on how we're showing up for each other.
I know at the hotline we've been doing our best to kind of keep track of how these stories are coming up. And at the beginning, when the stay-at-home orders were starting to be in place and the pandemic really hit the US, we added a field into our database in which we were able to capture when folks were mentioning COVID-19 as being part of their experience or being part of the challenges that they're facing when trying to come up with a safety plan or trying to leave or just survive within their abusive relationship. And I think something that I speak to a lot in the training is that any vulnerability or any perceived vulnerability that there is can and will be used against you by an abusive partner, right? And so this global pandemic is an absolute vulnerability for everyone involved. And then if we add the layers of the financial strain, we see the escalation of financial abuse often, right, outside of situations and experiences like the one we're collectively experiencing. So it doesn't come to a surprise for us how these vulnerabilities will just be easily turned into tactics of abuse. And we were able to collect a lot of just different stories of sentences, paragraphs that, you know, advocates were kind of sending to their managers. And I scrolled through those a few days ago, and we have over 50 pages of just a couple of different paragraphs from different people's stories of how these tactics, how COVID-19 has been used as tactics, which is either fear tactics, more of a reason to isolate the survivor, more of a reason to prevent them from leaving. Just the other day, we had an advocate share that there was a survivor who not only had been isolated because of COVID-19, but recently, earlier this week, she was locked out of her house, and the curfew that was used in the state was being used against her, and he would refuse to let her in past 8 p.m. And so she was scared to call law enforcement. She was African American. She was scared to call law enforcement. She was scared to leave. She didn't know where to go because she was afraid of what the curfew meant for her safety. And so we just see those compounding effects, right, when these experiences can be used as tactics against our survivors.
Thank you both for that. It's so significant and uplifting the stories, in particular marginalized communities. And it really is sort of telling or unfolding and unmasking for some, while for others who have been who are part of marginalized communities have known for a long time the ways in which really the government has failed to speak to us our experiences and our needs and be held accountable. I wanted to then, in thinking about those stories, thinking about how we are personally and our communities are impacted, and thinking of for all of you all, this is a question. Thinking about how COVID-19 has impacted, in particular, marginalized communities. What are some of the immediate policy proposals or recommendations you have? And what do you think the outcome of their implementation could be specifically for these communities?
I mean, I think the piece that we just heard about, that any vulnerability will be used is something that policymakers really need to think through. And I think even as we were tracking, and I'll drop this in the chat box, but there's a website where we're tracking all the enforcement orders across the country and, all the public health orders across the country and how they're being enforced. A few made exceptions for DV survivors, but not all. Right? So that you have a shelter-in-place order that says you can't leave your home except for an essential purpose, and there's no exception for if your home becomes unsafe, right? And so I think that is something that, is definitely a recommendation in this moment. I think the same is true for curfews, right? We just heard about how a curfew was used against a survivor. Curfews basically criminalize everybody who's outside. Many of the curfews I've seen, again, have exceptions for unhoused people, but, the cops get to decide who's unhoused by their criteria and who's not, and not for people who after 8 p.m. in New York need to get out of their house because it's unsafe, even if it's just for a walk to, get temporary, come up with a strategy or something. And so I really think that and then I think the piece about what happens when people test positive, I think we're moving from blanket stay-at-home orders now to, testing, tracking, tracing, quarantining, and containment. And so as a survivor, the first thing I thought is, what happens when you test positive? Your abuser finds out that they are now quarantined for 14 days because you tested positive. I can only imagine like the increased opportunities for violence that's going to produce, and then not complying because you don't want your abuser to find out, or you don't want to be in a more violent situation, then leads you to arrest. If you leave a quarantine situation, a lot of people have already been arrested for leaving quarantine. And so I'm very concerned that we're not centering survivors in this conversation, except to say, oh, DV is going up. In this moment, we need more of a response, read more law enforcement response. And meanwhile, we're throwing more law enforcement and criminalization as a response to the pandemic that is trapping survivors in the same trap that we keep putting them in, between no protection and policing that's actually making them less safe.
So I would add to all of that, and yes to everything Andrea just said, that there are a couple of macro level things that we can be thinking about too. One is, it's clear that the pandemic is going to cause tremendous economic stress. The research tells us that economic stress highly correlates with intimate partner violence. To the extent that people are losing jobs or being under and unemployed, violence is going to increase. So rather than putting money into policing, why are we not putting money into job creation, into job transition, into all of the kinds of economic stimulus that gets directly into the hands of people who need it, that could try to alleviate some of the economic stress that highly correlates with intimate partner violence? Similarly, this experience of the pandemic, coupled with the experience of George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor's death, I don't want to say any for fear of leaving out any, but all of the police misuse of force, excessive use of force, murdering of people is creating trauma. And all of that trauma is highly correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So what are we doing to take resources and put them into communities to really address that trauma in a way that will then help to decrease rates of violence? When we look just at the immediate, we're going to lose some of the macro structural stuff. And I think that macro structural piece is really important to people. So it's a both and. We need to be doing all of that. The third thing I wanted to add was just to lift up one particular community of survivors that hasn't gotten as much attention, and that's incarcerated people. That for incarcerated people, COVID is for some of them a death sentence. And so there is lots of organizing going on around commutation for incarcerated people, particularly for incarcerated survivors of violence. Now, for the vast majority of women and people who identify as women, cis women, trans women in women's facilities, that's most of them. But particularly, Survived and Punished is doing amazing work around this, both trying to do things like build resources for commissary, which people aren't getting, but also trying to get people out. We're doing it here in Maryland, where we represent the longest serving woman in the Maryland prison system who is an incarcerated survivor of violence. In any jurisdiction that you're in, there are people who are languishing in prisons who should not be there and who are exposed to this virus. And we have the opportunity to do some organizing across, across our silos for those who don't ordinarily work with incarcerated people to try to get them out.
Thank you both so much. There's so much that I'm holding and thinking about and processing as we're in conversation. And specifically the conversation around community care, but now also thinking around what it means to embark on community policy making. And what I mean by that is, how do we know these policies that are put in place are working for these communities? So I wanted to pose a question for all of you. What would intersect, in terms of, especially within COVID-19, what do you think to be the metrics, or what determines that policy is effective in meeting the needs, in particular, of marginalized communities? How are we able to measure intention and impact? What does it look like for us to think through transparency and accountability, especially on the part of federal lawmakers, in particular as people are critiquing past stimulus packages as not being enough and not addressing the most marginalized of our society?
Yeah, so in terms of what makes policy productive and successful, I think first and foremost about what are the current narratives about how society is just set up and it functions. Where are the values that, what are the values and the understandings that folks have, lawmakers have, policymakers have about how society works? And one of those, which I vehemently disagree with, is that cops keep us safe, and that cops are here for the protection of people and not of property. And so, especially in organizing work, a big thing of what we try to do is meet people where they are, and a lot of people are still at a place where they still see benefits from cops based on their current environment. And that's a juxtaposition of how abolitionist organization, abolitionist members, and being told by community that actually this cop makes me feel safe. But at the same time, we see very clear instances of where policing is not the solution to community violence and community safety. I'm thinking back to the time in 2017 when the NYPD stopped doing their, I guess they called it proactive policing. Proactive policing is essentially code for profiling. Essentially, the idea is that you can prevent, if you prevent the smaller crimes, then larger crimes are less deterred to be committed. But essentially what came out of that was they realized that all crimes went down. All crimes went down because police weren't creating the problem. They weren't going into communities and actually arresting people to have crimes to be committed. And so if policymakers are not on the same page of cops don't keep us safe, there's already a disconnect. Because it's how are we going to create, how is community going to put forth community-led solutions that go against the narrative that we don't need cops? And so I'm thinking of work I did with, in the Durham chapter of BRP 100, Durham Beyond Policing Coalition, SONG, Southerners on New Ground, Durham chapter, where we actively mobilized against the police chief, asking for 72 new cops over the course of 4 years. And initially that price point was about $1.4 million. which again is also just the undershot of that, right? Of, of this is only going to take $1.7 million. But out of that, we designed, and what we put forth after a community member, Mama Nia of Spirit House, suggested that why not we do this ourselves? Why not we take care of ourselves? Why not we create a community-led safety and wellness task force? And what does that look like? It looks like first responders are the police. And that is not the safest thing for the majority of Black and brown people. Honestly, anybody, period, but stats say the majority of Black and brown people. And so what we said was, this money for police is not necessary. If you want to ask for $1.7 million, if you've magically found that money for policing, you can surely find it for community invested and community-led solutions. So out of that, successfully, super excited to say that that was not passed, as in they did not get the money in order to get those 72 new officers. The money did go to getting all part-time city workers $15 an hour. The money did go to making sure that folks were able to get a bit more or more leeway in terms of pay leave and making sure that happened. And it also did put on the books and have a city council member in charge of chairing the safety and wellness task force. I'll also drop it in the chat in terms of our proposal. But these systems already exist in terms of what community care looks like when cops are not involved. When somebody who's responding to a crisis call for a survivor doesn't have their hand on their hip with their gun. There are ways to take care of ourselves, but if we're not starting from, can this be done without police, then I feel like that needs to be the jump part of the conversation in terms of creating policy for survivors and survivor-led.
I could not agree more. And my answer was going to be like, we need to ask survivors themselves. And that's what She Safe, We Safe is doing through the Story Collection Project. This assessment where it's like, we do scientific studies or academic studies, or where we're talking about recidivism and all kinds of other measures. We need to ask survivors what helped and what didn't, what worked and what didn't. And people to be like, yeah, sure, it was better after the cop than before the cop, but that doesn't mean I was safe. It just meant that, maybe something happened that shifted something in that moment. Or people often say it was worse after the cop. And frankly, that's the answer I've heard much more. And I think that the only thing I want to add to what Mariah just said is what my comrade Mariam Kaba at Interrupting Criminalization says often is that we are already engaged in the strategies that She Safe, We Safe is documenting. There is a vast body of folks who are engaging in safety and survival strategies. We're just the unfunded movement. We're just the unfunded anti-violence movement. There's the funded strategy, and then there's the unfunded strategy. There's the strategies that people like Spirit House and other folks are deploying that are not funded, and certainly not resourced to the extent that the funded strategies that rely on or are coupled with law enforcement are. And I think whenever you ask, or whenever, at least what I've seen in terms of asking folks what is most helpful to them, it's the unfunded strategies. And I think that goes right up to, we talked about trafficking and violence in the sex trades at the beginning of the call. We did a study when I was at the Sex Workers Project of survivors of trafficking and asked them what was most helpful, and none of them said police. They all said, my community not being criminalized for helping me. What was not helpful was a cop coming in and raiding my place of work, pistol whipping me and dropping and strip searching me in front of everybody. That was so much not helpful, and it would have been much more helpful if I could have reached out to the taxi driver or a family member, or even that clients who helped me wouldn't have been criminalized for coming forward and so forth, or taxi drivers who took me somewhere weren't being criminalized in the name of fighting trafficking. And I think we just really need to recognize that we need to ask survivors themselves. That's how we evaluate things. That's the only way to evaluate things, whether it's a diversion program, a program, and we need to ask folks questions in such a way that gets to the question that Mariah was just asking, is like, imagine if the response wasn't police, what would feel most useful? And that's going to really generate so much more of what people need and want. And those are the questions BYP 100 is asking, and those are the questions we all need to be asking.
And I think we need to be thoughtful about the metrics that people are using. So, for example, you hear all the time that domestic violence has dropped 63% since the inception of the Violence Against Women Act. Well, that's an interesting stat, right? When you pull it apart, what you find is that, yes, domestic violence has dropped. So has all violence. Violent crime in the United States has been dropping for years. So there's nothing that says that the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've been putting into the criminal legal system is responsible, through the Violence Against Women Act, is responsible for that drop. There are lots of reasons that that drop is happening. But you'll hear that used as the justification for continuing to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the criminal legal system, when in fact, for about the first 6 years of the Violence Against Women Act, crime and specifically intimate partner violence dropped about the same amount, but for the about 15 years after that, crime actually fell more than intimate partner violence fell, while we were still pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the criminal legal system. So you'll hear those metrics, right? The crime rate falling or the rate of intimate partner violence falling, used as justification for continuing to fund these failed strategies. We need to be really thoughtful and critical about what those numbers actually mean.
Ooh, I had to take a minute. This was really so needed. And in particular, Mariah, for sharing that case in particular that has a win for the community, I think it's so good to hear, because oftentimes the idea is that the fight feels so ongoing. Sometimes it feels like, is it going to be successful? If we organize around this, are we going to, it's good to hear, like, yes, like we're able to amplify our analyses, our experiences, our demands, and be met with a win, and be met with accountability, and be met with a reallocation of funds, because it's so necessary in meeting the needs of survivors. I wanted to take a moment to pose another question to you all, and it's along the same lines, but I wanted you all to provide like your perspectives, your insight on current policy terrain, current political terrain, and what sort of opportunities and challenges there are for intersectional advocacy and policymaking.
I mean, I think this opportunity, of the number one opportunity I'm seeing at this moment, it's like a radical reframing of what public safety means. So I guess it's a pretty big opportunity, but it's a moment where we're in a pandemic, where we're facing the biggest economic crisis of our lifetimes, and we really have to think carefully about where we're putting our resources and what strategies we're using. And I think these uprisings are about George Floyd, about Breonna Taylor, and about Tony McDade, and about the 2 men who were shot by police last night, and about the Black woman who was shot with a rubber bullet in the head at a protest and is still in the ICU, and about the 9-year-old Black girl who was pepper sprayed in the face. And all of that is what it's about right now. But it's also about police budgets and where our resources are going in the midst of a pandemic. It's about people recognizing that, Governor Cuomo cut Medicaid in the middle of a pandemic, and New York City is cutting everything, including summer youth programs, in its budget, except the police department. And in some cities, including Minneapolis, people are looking for increases in police money while they're facing massive cuts to budgets for things that people need, for the things that make up the unfunded anti-violence movement, right? Housing, community-based responses, community organizations, mental health, community-based mental health services, healthcare, income support that would make it possible for someone in this moment, in this economic crisis, to be a little bit safer, to adjust their strategies of safety in this moment. And so I think the challenge is, and the demand that is emerging, is to defund police. I think the challenge that's coming up for, I think, a lot of anti-violence organizations who have been increasingly embedded in law enforcement over the past 3 decades, and I was sort of typing in the chat that, as Lee was talking about reporting going down since the Violence Against Women Act, I mean, reporting is going down because people know that by reporting to a DV agency, they're reporting to the police. And a lot of folks are not down with that for many, many reasons, including their own safety and fear of deportation or that of their loved ones and families, or fear of child welfare involvement. I mean, it's just a very different thing to call your DV agency than it was in the 70s now. And I think DV agencies are going to have to take a stand, and anti-violence agencies are going to have to take a stand, and they're going to have to recognize that, yes, defund the police, might mean that the money you're getting through the police budget is not going to come anymore, and you're going to have to figure out other ways of resourcing the work that you do that don't depend on policing in the state. But anti-violence organizations have been very silent for the most part around both the demands around the violence that police violence we've been talking about, particularly about their support for defund police. And anti-violence organizations are going to have to go beyond a tweet, a statement, of blacking out their social media for a day, and they're going to have to act like Black Lives Matter, like Black women, queer, and trans lives matter, which means defund police is the demand. Get behind it. And to the extent that that affects your resources, then you're going to have to really think about where anti-violence organizations are embedded, and what needs to shift, and where you need to shift to align with the priorities of the intersectional priorities, the priorities of the people who are experiencing this moment at the intersection of many, many forms of oppression that require that demand. So I think that's going to be the challenge, is for people to really get behind that, and also to recognize that that's a demand that's not just about defunding police departments and then funding a collaboration with the DV agency and the police around something, right? And the money goes to the DV agency, but it's still going to policing. No, it means defund policing no matter who's doing it. And defund, things that are, clothed in another name, but basically the same thing. And so that's a radical reimagination. We all have to really deeply sit and reimagine what safety looks like, and how we take an example that we hear through the She Safe, We Safe campaign and align our work with that, and resource it, and get ourselves the skills and the relationships and the structures that are going to make that possible on a larger scale, and be willing to get behind people who are demanding a radical change in how we resource and what we resource. And to recognize that housing, healthcare, mental health services, income supports, migration status, those are anti-violence strategies. And I guess the last thing is, Breonna Taylor was killed in her bed in her home. I think that if we're anti-DV agencies and we care about people being killed in their home, then I'm not sure why I'm not seeing, anti-violence agencies kind of at the front lines of saying Breonna Taylor's name and making demands that are not carceral demands, that are demands, yes, that officers be terminated, but also that no-knock warrants be ended, and also the war on drugs that drove those cops into her house be ended, and that really people like Breonna Taylor need to be safe in their home, not only from people who live there, but from people who come in from outside, and from all the things that drive them there.
Yes to all of that, Andrea, and I'm also really want to convey that, yes, we need to know about our wins, but in reality, revolution is not seen so hard if we just know our history. Like, we are not new to this. This has been happening. She Safe, We Safe was created in the footsteps of organizations like Sister to Sister, of organizations like Insight, of collectives like the Combahee River Collective. Like, this work has been being done. It's just that this is, again, these are not the narratives and the understandings of how the world is and how community shows up and how we exist to be public. And so I personally I appreciate everyone for being on this call, for taking the time to consider what's beyond, and again, what's already been happening. Because yeah, this is not inventing the wheel. This is trying to make the wheel just the wheel and not something else. Not something to be put to the side, but to be put in the forefront.
I would just add a couple of challenges. So yes to everything, and then a couple of challenges that I see. One is going to be retrenchment, that uprisings make people afraid, and when people are afraid, they turn to police. And so for us to make this case, it's really, really important that people who haven't been part of this struggle before become part of this struggle. And I think one of the amazing things that I was seeing on Twitter this morning was, people in communities that have never had any kind of protest against police brutality are protesting. And so that gives me some faith, but power doesn't give itself up easily. And we can't underestimate the power that police unions and some policymakers, many policymakers, have to keep that money right where it is. And so then the second challenge becomes, can you do it without the money, right? And Andrea and Mariah both talked about the unfunded work that we do. And if you read the history of the anti-violence movement, one of the things that you see, and I'm going to oversimplify, I know it's a lot more complex, is that the more money that went into the movement, the more bureaucratized the movement became, the farther it moved away from its roots. You know, when Andrea talked about it being very different to call a shelter in the 70s, part of that is about the way that money came into the system. And so what does it mean to take that money, and who controls that money, and what are the conditions that come with that money? We have to be really thoughtful about how all of that is going to work. Because if we're not, we'll just recreate the same problematic systems that we have, just with different names. The last challenge, I think, for me is pushing people to see that being anti-racist isn't enough, that you can talk all day long about how awful it is that Black people are treated the way they are treated in this country. And if you want to talk all day long about that, that's fine, but it doesn't change anything. And I think that's where anti-violence organizations are. They're willing to say, no, this is really bad, but they're not willing to say what they're going to do about it. And so we've got to help people get to that next step.
Yeah, I would, to add to that, I think that's exactly where the conversation has to be. I know that as far as challenges in the terrain that our policy team right now is kind of facing is just the history, right, of where, at least for us in the intimate partner violence movement, what it means, what these responses have meant. If people think of intimate partner violence, they think of VAWA, right? And when we think of VAWA, it's truly just the prime example of what happens when something is produced through that sort of carceral feminist lens, right? And how are we going to bring this back to what are we actually seeing on the lines? So I know that our policy team has been working to amplify those voices and those stories as far as what our survivors are afraid of, right? Because I love the question that you posed earlier, Andrea, like what if the first response wasn't law enforcement? What can we dream of then? What can we create then? And that's the direction we really need to go. As far as the hotline, we constantly hear that over the lines, the fear that there is just reaching out to what is supposed to be the first response. And what is the area for safety when the response to violence is a system that represents violence to you and those you care about, right? So we have countless stories of survivors who are wanting and needing safety and are afraid to call the police for what that might mean for them, for being arrested for just being Black, just being a person of color, just being in their community, or even hearing those really disheartening stories of survivors not feeling like they can call the police because their partner is Black, because the person who's causing violence has these systems of violence just overloaded on them, and that could be a death sentence, that there's that possibility of more danger and more harm being caused to their partner when their partner's the one causing their harm too. And so we kind of have to hold that and balance that in with their experience. And one of the things that our policy team has done a lot is really try to amplify the story logs that kind of involve this and illustrate this, because our advocates have been hearing these stories for a very long time. And it was fairly recently, about 2 weeks ago or a month ago, that we were finally able to kind of add some fields to our database that are now going to allow us to tell that story with the rest of the data that we collect. So we do ask some sort of general questions sometimes, collect some demographics and some details of our survivor stories that can include anything from maybe our survivor is homeless, maybe our survivor has experience with children being involved or children being part of their story. And one thing that we never really had was law enforcement, further than the abusive partners in law enforcement. And we've been able to add the fields that are now going to capture that a survivor is not wanting to get a police report, is not wanting to go to courts, or not wanting to get a protective order or involve any sort of system because of fear of law enforcement. Or maybe they have called law enforcement before and they've been the ones who've been arrested, right? Or just fear in general. And I think that is really what we're needing to have in that policy conversation, is when the first response is what's bringing on and exacerbating these fears, what do we have left? Where do we need to move this? And we're hoping that this will help our data and the stories we need to be telling on the Hill get our bills and policy reflecting that.
Thank you all so much. Your comments have generated several questions, and I actually wanted to introduce them now because I think they're really good. The first question focused specifically on working or figuring out non-incarceration alternatives to policing. And I think that's definitely a conversation like in a lot of informal circles, because it's about framing as well that Mariah, you pointed to earlier. Oftentimes, like, this is just how we're socialized in this country. The police are here to protect, but whom or what? As we've seen over the past couple of days, it feels more so about protecting property as opposed to human life. And when we're talking about survivors now, especially within COVID-19, like, how are we thinking through non-incarceration alternatives for those who are, you know, sheltered in place or are living with abusive partners?
I just dropped in the chat box that there's a lot of resources at transformharm.org that Mariam Kaba pulled together for us. And that a lot of those apply now, right? I think we just need to adjust them to this moment. A lot of them are about figuring out different interruption strategies in partnership with the survivor, that many of them can happen with a mask. I remember when I was living above a survivor across the street from where I am now, I went and I asked her, I knew they were both migrants. I said, what do you want me to do next time I hear him throwing you around? And she said, just make a lot of noise and he'll know that you're listening and he'll stop. And so I can do that with a mask on. I don't need to, you know, worry. Like, it's not a different strategy because of COVID and the fact that it's happening more often during COVID, which just means I'm home more often also to witness it, right? And so I think that there's so many strategies at the resources there. I want to point folks also to the Creative Interventions Toolkit that was put out by Mimi Kim, who many folks know about. And it has just a wealth of tools in there and just strategies people have tried and created. There's the Stop Violence, Storytelling Organizing Project, Stop, that Creative Interventions did, that has stories. And I think that so much of the organizing we're doing now is around mutual aid. That creates an infrastructure that can also be turned to responding to the harm and danger that people are experiencing during COVID. It's the same infrastructure that we're creating. People, networks of care, people looking out for each other, people asking for help, receiving help that don't involve the state. And so let's figure out how to divert resources to those and to really invest in those, not just with our resources, but with our minds and our beliefs in what's legitimate and what's an important response in this moment. Because I do agree with what Lee said earlier that, you know, fear means more cops, and also this is a moment where, like, the rise in DV and the pandemic could lead to a doubling down on strategies that we should be moving away from.
I also wanted to talk about, I think somebody specifically said non-police, but still said incarceration. And so I'm like, I want to untangle that too, because I want to ask folks, like, what is the current function of jails and of prisons? And I'm in the belief that the current function of jails and prisons is to not deal with an issue. It's literally to hide what the problem is and not actually try to change anything, transform anything. There is no resolution to putting people in cages. There's no correction of harm to putting people in cages. There's only, like, reification of harm when that happens. And so in terms of, I appreciate the resources drop, transform harm in the chat, but also to think about, like, again, the fundamental ways of how we believe things are working and are moving and their purpose, right? So what is the true outcome that folks want in terms of addressing harm? Like, some survivors don't want resolution with their harm, with the people who harmed them. Sometimes justice looks like beating somebody, like beating somebody because they don't, this is what they need, this is what they want. And again, in terms of when we're thinking about survivor-led solutions, and we're thinking about how to show up for survivors, part of that is knowing, are you equipped to do what the survivor wants, number one, and then two, do you have the resources that are needed if if transformation is actually what you want. Yeah.
So, and my and would be, people are talking a lot about restorative and transformative justice these days. That is a conversation I think that we need to be having, and we need to be thoughtful about how we have it. Restorative justice that happens in the context of diversion from prosecution is not the kind of thing that we're talking about in terms of creating real resources that exist outside of the carceral system. So when we talk about RJ and TJ, it's important to be thoughtful about kind of where that's happening, what spaces that's happening in, and who's controlling it. It's also, I think, beyond kind of the immediate crisis, we need to be thinking about prevention, and we need to be thinking about prevention very differently. We need to be funding prevention differently. There's so much work that we could be doing on the front end using, good research that exists about what are the correlates of intimate partner violence, what is driving violence, and how do we interrupt it. That doesn't require after the fact interventions by police that do nothing to address the core causes of this violence. And we've been tied, this is something I've said a lot, we've been tied to this narrative about what causes intimate partner violence, that intimate partner violence is caused by one person wanting power and control over their intimate partner in the service of the patriarchy. And that, I think, is not a definition that's going to get us much of anywhere, because it doesn't allow us to look at those correlates like economic stress, like previous experiences of trauma that may be driving part of the violence. So there was something in the chat about interacting with those who use violence. And I think that's got to be a key part of what we do. Because if that's whose behavior needs to change, we need to think about how we make that behavior change. The way that we do better intervention in most places now doesn't do that, because it cannot admit for itself that people can be complex, that they can both have been harmed and that they can do harm. And if we don't address people's underlying trauma and we don't address the other conditions in their lives, we're not going to stop the violence. We can also use restorative programs to prevent harm. There's great work going on, for example, in Baltimore City through the Levitas Initiative, working on using restorative justice to do sexual violence prevention with kids. That's the place where some of this work needs to be happening. So there's lots of good stuff out there that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you all. Another question that came in focused specifically on what does it look like for us in this work to work with abusers and those who cause harm, and sort of rethinking what it then means to engage with community members, hold people accountable, so on and so forth. Another question to you all. And sorry, I'm trying to keep track of the chat is hot, which I thoroughly enjoy. I love that we're having this conversation. But yeah, I think a lot of people are thinking through, well, how do we stay in community with people who cause harm? What does it mean to go forward? I was wondering, yeah, just any of you all who have sort of any insight in what that looks like.
Hard, messy, not fully formed. I think that, and I'm seeing some of this in the chat, I think that the assumption is that unless we have the perfect answer over here, scaled up to a national scale, that PS we're supposed to build with no resources because we're not going to invest in it until we know that it's perfect. No one's going to shift from what is. And I think that's not how transformation works in society. We have to try things, and some of them will be unsuccessful. And I've been part of accountability strategies that have not gone well and have not felt satisfactory to the survivor, have allowed harm or allowed conditions to persist where harm continued to be possible. And also that's true with when the police intervene. So we can't expect the solution that we're asking for before we're willing to shift our thinking to be perfect. We have to be willing to always, and this goes back to this evaluation question, center survivors and say, this police thing isn't working. Can we try this? Okay, I just want to say up front, it might not work either, but we're going to try and make it better than that. And then we're just going to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. And we have to recognize that, you know, we're talking about systems and dominance and control and violence that are entrenched and are rooted in many cases in systems of oppression that some of us continue to participate in or benefit from. And so we're going to have to just be willing to keep trying, but we cannot expect an unresourced movement to scale up the perfect response, shiny thing that we can then point to. Then people will be like, oh, okay, well, now we'll move to that. That's not how the anti-violence movement was built. The anti-violence movement was built by, come into my house. I don't know if it's going to help. I don't know if it's going to hurt, but let's just try. And we need to be able to do that. We need to have the resources to do that. We need to have the willingness to experiment in the name of survivors' lives and safety, and achieving better results for them than we're seeing right now, which includes survivors being criminalized, many of them being incarcerated, as Lee was talking about earlier. After mandatory arrest went into place, the arrests of women skyrocketed, and the arrests of survivors skyrocketed, and the arrests of LGBTQ survivors skyrocketed. I mean, that's not an improvement over what's happening before, to experience violence and experience criminalization and incarceration, which will then be used as a weapon against you to further isolate you in the ways that April was talking about. Like, we have to understand that what's happening now is not working. And I've seen in the chat some sort of conversations about prosecutors, and I mean, people on this call who know me that just, as a defense attorney, and also as someone who feels clear that prosecutors' jobs are to put people in cages, and there's no way you can progressive that. That we have to figure out strategies that actually center what people need. And it might be that you work with a particular prosecutor to reduce harm, but we have to understand that that prosecutors are still prosecuting survivors and criminalizing survivors, and that prisons are sites of physical and sexual violence for survivors, no matter how great their programming is for survivors. They're still experiencing sexual violence on the way to the programming, and on the way back from the programming, and after the programming, and they should never be receiving programming or services in a cage anyway, because who on this call goes to therapy thinks it would be a great idea to get that in a cage? So I just feel like there's so much to say about that, but I just really want us to, if we take anything away from this, that the system as it is now is harming survivors. It is not protecting survivors. And an intersectional analysis will show that and will reinforce that every time we deploy it. And so the notion that we have to have a perfect system before we're able to move from one that is, if you take an intersectional lens to it, harming survivors, so many of them, and not helping them, is a disservice to survivors.
And to add to that, it's a disservice to those who cause harm. I know that that's, you know, the question that constantly gets asked is, how do we then use this kind of framework with those who are causing harm? And it's messy. You're right. That's exactly it, is how it's interesting how we will turn to that, right? Want to focus on the individual when the problem is really the systemic issues, right? We can't remove intimate partner violence if we're not addressing all the other types of violence that correlate with it. So while the focus, I think it feels almost easier to focus on the individual. I see, Deborah, I saw you write that like batterer intervention programs themselves are so tied to the carceral state. And that's exactly what we see on the lines when we get those who cause harm calling us needing or wanting support. And in some states, you can only go to these programs if it is mandated. And that's just the way the system has worked, right? But if we break down the program itself, it's absolutely problematic, right? Because it's within that framework of that sort of punishment and shaming. And so there's so many different areas in which we need to bring it back to that survivor-centered approach of what are the systems that are affecting not only the survivor, but the abusive partners as well. What is continuing to bring this up? Because focusing on the individual isn't going to change. Even if we have the best perfect plan, it gets messy and we can't apply it to all situations, and it doesn't work for all situations. And we need to keep that in mind.
I think we also have to be realistic about the fact that some survivors still want a carceral intervention, and that is a kind of a hard truth that we need to grapple with. And you know, in part that's true because that's all we've ever offered. So if the only thing that you know is justice is a penal intervention, is a carceral intervention, and you don't get it, then you feel like you haven't gotten justice. And part of that ugliness and messiness in making this kind of transition, I think that we all envision, is trying to kind of make that, move us away from a notion of penal incarceration as, or, you know, penal intervention as punishment, as justice, to a much more expansive vision of justice that actually meets survivors' needs. But there's going to be ugliness kind of in the interim when people say, I'm not getting justice because justice for me was punishment. And I think that's something we really do have to grapple with.
I just want to lift up an example of that, even from our own organizing. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat of the In Our Names Network, which is an organization, a network of organizations around the country that work on police violence against Black women, queer, and trans people. And our last retreat last summer at the Highlander Center, to be frank, we had conversations with folks in the room being like, I'm Black and trans, and if someone kills me, I really expect y'all to go put their ass in a cage. And if you don't, I'm gonna come back and haunt you. And you know, I understand the motivation behind it, because they're saying, you know, we're watching videos like the one we just saw last night of Black trans women being beaten with all community watching, including Black cis women, or participating, and they're like, this is not acceptable. There needs to be some accountability. And it was about really shifting the thinking that you're just describing, Lee, which all of us, I'm sure, have experienced, myself included, is the notion that the value of my life is determined by how long someone else does in a cage for hurting me. And that's not how the value of my life should be determined. The value of my life should be determined by how my community shows up for me and what reparations I get when someone harms me. And reparations definitely mean accountability for the person who harmed me, and repair, and a commitment to not repeating that behavior, and a commitment by my community to not letting that behavior repeat. That doesn't mean, and if we offer folks something that is different than someone going in a cage, then it might ease that. And I think we came out of that in the networks, in our Names Network gathering, with a clear commitment collectively, not just the trans folks in the group, but everyone, of all gender identities, saying we are committed to creating systems of safety for trans people that don't involve the police, because if we don't do that, then our calls for abolition leave them feeling unvalued and unprotected. And so, and to also committing to advancing, and one of our members, you know, her father was killed in front of her by police. I mean, she's just like, I don't understand what you're talking about. That man has to get punished. He has to go to jail. And we had to come back and say, can we think about reparations? Can we think about, yes, he should be fired. Yes, he should never have a job where he has a gun again or power again. Yes, he should, and yes, he should be made to atone and attend to your family's pain and hurt. And so should the system that put him there to do it. And actually, will that produce more justice for you? And we learned that in part from the work that was done in Chicago with the police torture survivors, who, you know, really wanted prosecution of this man who tortured hundreds of them and sent them to jail for decades, taking decades of their lives away from them. We demanded prosecution for a long time. They got prosecution, they got conviction, they got incarceration. And at the end, they were like, but I still lost those 20 years of my life, and my family still lost, and I'm still in the same situation. And this hasn't actually healed me in any way. In fact, the process of the prosecution harmed me more in some ways. And so we really had to come up with, like, what does reparations look like? And I just saw someone park in the chat box, and I didn't read the full comments, it just popped up on the screen, that's restorative justice. That's what has been, it's coming to be called restorative justice, is still very much an individual one-to-one process, and it's one that's more and more mediated and controlled by courts. So what I just described, I don't call restorative justice, I call that reparations. And that we can talk about reparations for survivors of domestic violence, survivors of sexual assault, survivors of police violence, on individual and systemic things at the same time that are not tied to courts and systems that are already set up to kill us and not protect us.
Thank you all for that. I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that this is being recorded and we'll make this available to you all. I'm also going to make sure to save the chat. And because I have all of your email addresses, I'm going to send out an email to see those folks who would like to stay connected with each other, just to figure out a way to sort of take out a lot of the logistical, like, confusion that may come through in trying to coordinate through the chat, just as something to help us like push forward and keeping on with this conversation because it's so good. I wanted to share another question that was shared earlier. There are folks who are interested in learning more about working groups or initiatives that focus specifically on working with those who have caused harm and abusers, because the critique is that, and it's true, like better intervention programs are so tied to the carceral state. So maybe in your own personal experience or different organizations that you know that have taken on working with abusers is the question that's being asked.
In Philadelphia, there was 2 organizations that work, well, they still are. One is called Philly's Pissed, and the other one is called Philly's Stand Up, and I can never remember which one is which. But they work in tandem, but one works with the person who did harm and one works with the survivor, and then they work in parallel and together. And so that's a model I think is really helpful. And I think that in the pod mapping and transformative strategies that Mia Mingus and other folks have put out, there is this notion that you create, you as a larger community, figure out how to work with both people in order to come to a process of repair.
I now wanted to provide an opportunity for those folks who have any other questions on the chat, who are, or to any of our participants, if they have questions, to share by the chat or the Q&A function. And I'll be on hold for a bit. Well, not on hold, but I'll be on mute as questions come in. And also just wanted to take time to, before even closing out, thank our speakers, because this has been such a great conversation thus far. I've learned a lot. I'm sure other folks are learning a lot as well in terms of resources and how to move forward, and just extremely grateful to have you all here with us. I want now then to leave you all with a question, a final question, but really like just wanted to learn more about what thoughts, tools, resources, anything really that you would like to leave with participants today following this conversation.
Yeah, thank you again for having me, Nana. I really appreciate everyone on this panel and their expertise that they brought and perspective to how we can show up for survivors and making sure we're creating mechanisms to make sure that all of us are kept safe. Yeah, just thinking of a few things that BRP have done this year and that we're continuing to do through the She Safe, We Safe campaign. Every first Tuesday, except this month because we forego the meeting for the sake of this panel, but we have a public organizing meeting for the She Safe, We Safe campaign. At that meeting is a point for folks who want to know how to get involved to do so, as well as any updates we have going on in the campaign. Our May call, was it May? Yes, because it's June now. Time is very strange in the COVID times. In our May call, we actually did our joint call was with the hotline to talk about when home isn't safe, and talked exactly about the exacerbation of domestic and interpersonal violence during the time of COVID, but also talking about when you don't have a shelter in place to be in place at, and how that also is a form of violence. So yeah, I would encourage folks who are interested in getting invested in the campaign, learning more about the story collection project and how you all can be involved. We are only taking the stories of Black folks, i.e. those of the African diaspora, their experience with state violence, as well as interpersonal violence for that survey. But I'll also drop the links to those in the chat box. And again, thank you all so much for being here. It's better to ask questions than to not. So really appreciate it.
I'm just in the chat, the question was, do folks think it'll ever change? Do we have hope? And I think I definitely have days where that's the main question that I have. And there's a sticker that around here somewhere that has one of Mariam's quotes on it that, let this radicalize you and not lead you to despair. And I feel like every day that's what I'm getting up. It's helped me get up. But I think also it's remembering that a lot of what we're seeing right now didn't exist 40 years ago in my lifetime, right? And so things can shift in my lifetime too. And that it's a slow process, but there's also moments of tremendous opening. And we are in one of those moments. Now, it's a tremendous opening that white supremacy and fascism are lining up to shove their way through and increasing police response and carcerality and investment in prisons and police as opposed to things that actually keep us safe. But it's also a moment that we can shove our dreams into. And so I think for me, every day I get up and just think, what can I do that will open that crack a little bit more? What can I do to fill that crack with flowers as opposed to guns? And, what can I do to really embody and live the community in the world that I'm dreaming of, that I may not live to see, but I'm hoping that Mariah and all the BYP 100 young soldiers will see, So I think, and my nieces and nephews and great nieces and those to come. And so I think we have to just practice one thing at a time. And for some of you, that's having a conversation with folks at your agency. It's about strategizing in the ways that Nan was talking about how to move this conversation across the movement. And also it's getting behind folks who are taking bold risks and making bold steps right now. And, we may fall 10 times, but the 11th time we're gonna, another piece of the portal is gonna open, we're gonna be able to move through. So I really feel like, and practicing small things, because it's one intervention that we talked about earlier at Spirit House that can give us imagination, open our imagination for, wait, what if we did these 10 other things as 10 other ways? And we just really need to create those spaces to dream and practice in, even when we feel like the walls are closing in and everything is getting worse. There's still possibility in the ways protesters are helping each other in the middle of an uprising, where someone who knows someone's a survivor who's at the protest is saying, let's figure out another strategy for you right now, right here, in this moment. And if we can build and multiply those things, I think we'll see the results.
So I think I know that it can change because I changed. When I started doing this work, I was 25 years old, I was fresh out of law school, and I was convinced that the only way to address this problem was through incarceration, that all people who used violence were monsters and that they all needed to be put away, and that was the way to do this work. And it was really through intersectionality that I started to grow and change and understand the problem differently and understand why my perspective, which was a white perspective, which was the only thing that I knew, was not a good perspective, a useful perspective for the vast majority of my clients who were Black women and Latinx women. And so, learning from them, growing with them, doing the reading, putting the work in, I've changed. I did not start out an abolition feminist. I would absolutely call myself one now. And so I know that we can change. It's not easy and it's not quick and it requires us to put the work in, but we can make this change. If you had told me, even 5 years ago, when my book first came out, it was pretty hotly debated as to whether this was something we would even ever talk about publicly. If you had told me we'd be having this particular conversation, I might have told you were nuts. I remember, Andrea, and I know you'll remember too, being at a meeting on mandatory arrest where they were like, mandatory arrest may not be a good idea. And we were both like, really? Really? So we're having very different conversations in this movement than we were having even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so I absolutely believe that we can change. And so I'll just end with yet another Mariame Kaba quote, which is that hope is a discipline. And so, for us to make that change requires us to put that work in and day out.
And I think I just want to add to kind of taking that sort of personal, individual opportunity or realization for change and apply it to the bigger scope for organizations in the DV field, and how we have to accept that responsibility and how we are complicit in these systems, depending on how we are, where we're getting our resources from, and where we're getting our trainings from, and where we're supporting and directing our survivors to, as far as their safety plans and their direct first responders. And we need to do that work actively and intentionally, and need to be critically thinking about that sort of intersectionality of violence, which has been true forever in order to have successful white supremacy and colonization. Sexual violence was always used, and it's nothing new to see that these types of violence used as tools that are just as powerful as the weapons that were used against Indigenous peoples and populations all over the world. And we need to know that in order for this violence, that intimate partner violence that so much of our focus is on, we need to expand that, and we need to expand our analysis of how it intersects with violence stemming from racism. And it's a lot of work, and we need to be very intentional in how the work in the DV field needs to shift as well, to really center the needs of those who are being the most affected by what's supposed to be supporting them. And so it's a big responsibility. And the quote that stood out to me yesterday was the Angela Davis quote of, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it every single day, and we have to act that way." And that's where I'll leave that.
Thank you all so very much. I feel full in a way that I haven't felt in a long time. I'm grateful to you all. I'm grateful to all of our participants for all the questions, for everybody that contributed to making this webinar a success. I'm so grateful for this conversation and feeling just much more just motivated, especially during such a heavy time. So thank you all once again. I am saving the chat right now as we speak, because I want to make sure that you all have access to that. I'm also making sure that we all have the recording as well. But thank you all so much. And thank you to everybody once again. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for an incredible hosting and moderation and questions, and just for all the work that you hold every day, Nana, and particularly today. I just really want to lift you up and send you my heart and my sisterhood.
Absolutely that, and thanks to the Hotline too for being willing to host this conversation and being one of the few national organizations that has been out in front on this.
Yeah, Sissy will remember that you all were here first, and making sure that this was part of the conversation, and again, the conversation to be had. So yes, deeply appreciative to you, Nana, and to the Hotline.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thrilled to have been able to hear from you all. And we're only in this conversation because of the work that you all have been doing on the ground for decades now. So thank you so much.
Yes, be well, everybody. Thank you so much.
Take care. Stay safe.